Jung discovered something that made his blood run cold. There's a type of person walking among us who looks broken on the surface, quiet, withdrawn, damaged by their past, but underneath that exterior, something dangerous is forming, something most people will never understand. Jung studied what happens when empaths experience severe trauma and withdraw completely from society. And he found that only a small percentage of people who enter this psychological state survive the transformation intact. The rest, they either shatter completely under the weight of what they've seen, or they get stuck in a twilight zone between two worlds, too aware to fit back into normal society, too wounded to fully stand alone, trapped in a psychological no man's land that slowly destroys them from the inside out. Jung spent decades studying this pattern, patient after patient, case after case. And what he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about trauma, isolation, and human transformation. He realized he wasn't documenting mental illness. He was witnessing a process he called individuation under extreme duress, the kind that either kills you or makes you untouchable. If you've ever preferred being alone after experiencing betrayal, abandonment, or deep hurt, you might be in the middle of this dangerous process right now. And what comes next will determine whether you emerge transformed or remain trapped in unconscious suffering. They didn't choose to become loners. This is critical to understand. It wasn't a lifestyle preference or a personality quirk. It was a survival tactic born from necessity. They saw too much betrayal, too many smiling faces that concealed knives, too many promises that dissolved like sugar in rain, too many people who claimed they cared, but vanished the moment caring required actual sacrifice. Here's what Jung discovered that most people miss. These individuals were likely highly sensitive before they became isolated. They were the emotional shock absorbers for their families, their friend groups, their workplaces. Everyone dumped their pain into these people like they were psychological landfills, and they accepted it because they thought that's what love meant. That's what being good meant. That's what being valuable meant. They became experts at reading rooms before entering them. They learned to detect emotional landmines in conversations. They developed the ability to sense what people needed before those people even knew they needed it. This wasn't a gift from the universe. It was a survival skill forged in the fire of unpredictable chaos. Think about it. When your safety depends on correctly predicting your parents' mood, your brain rewires itself for threat detection. When your peace relies on managing everyone else's emotions, you become a human emotional radar. When your value is determined by how useful you are, you become indispensable by necessity, until they snapped. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand what led up to it. Consider a case profile that perfectly illustrates Jung's observations on participation mystique and boundary dissolution. We see this dynamic clearly in the story of a young woman who spent 28 years absorbing everyone else's chaos. Her alcoholic father's unpredictable rage, her mother's martyrdom and silent resentment, her siblings' constant drama that always somehow became her responsibility to manage. She developed what we might now call heightened pattern recognition. She could predict her father's mood by the sound of his car door closing. She knew whether he'd had one drink or five by the weight of his footsteps on the stairs. She could sense her mother's incoming breakdown by subtle changes in vocal tone, by the way she stirred her coffee, by the particular silence that filled the house on certain mornings. She knew which sibling was about to create a crisis based on text message punctuation. A period instead of an exclamation mark meant trouble. No emoji meant something was wrong. Too many emojis meant they were hiding something. This wasn't psychic ability, it was survival mathematics. When your safety depends on reading the room correctly, your brain becomes a supercomputer of behavioral analysis. These individuals who eventually isolate don't just endure abuse, they study it, they catalog it. They become walking databases of human dysfunction. Every micro-expression, every tonal shift, every behavioral pattern. They store this information unconsciously, building a psychological archive that would terrify most people if they could see inside it. And here's what made Jung's hands shake when he wrote his clinical notes. These individuals never used this knowledge, not once. They had detailed maps of everyone's weaknesses, triggers, and insecurities. They could have weaponized this information at any moment. They knew exactly what to say to destroy someone emotionally. They understood the precise words that would shatter someone's confidence or expose their deepest fears. But they didn't. They just kept absorbing, kept hoping, kept believing that if they were good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, people would finally treat them with the care they deserved. They thought their kindness would eventually be rewarded, that their loyalty would eventually be reciprocated, that their unconditional love would eventually be valued. They were wrong. Then came the moment that changed everything. The final betrayal, the one that broke through decades of conditioning and forced them to see reality clearly. Maybe it was discovering infidelity after years of being told they were paranoid for asking questions. Maybe it was realizing their entire family scapegoated them to avoid their own dysfunction. Maybe it was the friend who disappeared when they finally needed support instead of giving it. Maybe it was overhearing what someone really thought about them after years of pretending to care. Maybe it was being blamed for setting a boundary after decades of having none. Maybe it was watching someone give to others. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. What they claimed they couldn't give to them. Whatever the trigger, something inside them clicked. A switch flipped that could never be unflipped. Jung would recognize this as the moment when an inner situation finally becomes conscious. And they entered what can be understood as 4 stages of transformation after severe relational trauma. Stage 1, the observation phase. They stop talking and start watching. This is where they become what we might call human lie detectors. But it's more than that. They've been observing their whole lives. The difference now is that they're observing consciously, deliberately, without the filter of hope that used to distort their perception. They notice everything. The way someone's eyes shift left when they're fabricating a story. The subtle change in breathing pattern when guilt surfaces. The micro-expression of contempt that flashes for a fraction of a second before the polite smile returns. They see the gap between what people say and what people do. And that gap tells them everything they need to know. They start to notice patterns they'd been trained to ignore. How certain people only call when they need something. How some friends only show up when life is going well, but disappear when things get hard. How family members take and take and take, but call you selfish the moment you stop giving. Most people call this paranoia. Family members say they're being negative, looking for problems, creating drama where none exists. Friends accuse them of being too sensitive, too suspicious, too judgmental, but they're not imagining things. They're finally trusting what they've always seen, but were taught to ignore. Their nervous system has been trained by years of trauma to detect inconsistency and danger. And now, without the desperate need for approval clouding their judgment, that system is operating at peak efficiency. They're not paranoid, they're aware, and awareness in a world full of unconscious people looks like paranoia to those who refuse to see clearly. Jung noted in his clinical work that during phases of awakening consciousness, individuals often become very quiet in social settings. People interpret this as depression or withdrawal. It's actually the opposite. They're conducting psychological research in real time. Every conversation becomes a data collection opportunity. Every interaction reveals information that others miss completely. They're watching who keeps their word and who makes excuses, who shows up consistently and who only appears when it's convenient, who asks about their life and who only talks about themselves, who respects boundaries and who punishes them for having any. The data is conclusive, and it's often devastating. Stage 2. Shadow integration. This is where things get truly dangerous, and it's where most people in their lives start to panic, because the isolated individual stops being nice and starts being real. They begin what Jung extensively documented as shadow work, accepting their own capacity for darkness, aggression, and self-protection. Jung understood something that most modern psychology still struggles with. You cannot heal what you cannot acknowledge, and these individuals had spent their entire lives denying their shadow, denying their anger, denying their resentment, denying their right to boundaries, to standards, to expectations of reciprocity. They believed that having boundaries made them bad, that saying no made them selfish, that protecting themselves made them cruel, that expecting basic respect made them demanding, that wanting reciprocity made them transactional. So they gave and gave and gave until there was nothing left, until they were hollow shells performing kindness while dying inside. Shadow integration, as Jung described it, means accepting the full spectrum of human emotion and capacity. Yes, they can be gentle, but they can also be ruthless. Yes, they can be compassionate, but they can also be cold. Yes, they can forgive, but they can also cut someone off with surgical precision and never look back. They realize they've been denying themselves access to half of their emotional range. They've been taught that anger is bad, that boundaries are mean, that protecting yourself is selfish. But anger is information. Boundaries are healthy. Self-protection is necessary. And they're finally giving themselves permission to access the parts of themselves they were taught to suppress. This terrifies everyone around them. The person who used to absorb everyone's bad behavior starts reflecting it back like a mirror. The person who used to accept disrespect starts naming it clearly and removing themselves from its presence. The person who used to apologize for existing starts taking up space without explanation or justification. The person who used to smile through pain starts showing their real feelings. The person who used to say yes to everything starts saying no without guilt. The person who used to chase after people starts letting them go without a fight. People don't like this. People liked them better when they were manageable, when they could be guilted, manipulated, controlled, when their kindness could be taken for granted, when their presence could be assumed, when their forgiveness was guaranteed. Now they can't be, and that loss of control makes people react with shocking cruelty. Stage 3. The chrysalis, total isolation. This is the danger zone, the stage where the majority of people fail, where they either retreat back into their old patterns because the loneliness becomes unbearable, or descend into bitterness and permanent isolation. But the individual who successfully navigates this stage, they emerge as something extraordinary. They cut everyone off to rebuild their mind, not out of hatred, not out of revenge, out of necessity. They disappear from social circles, stop answering messages that used to trigger immediate anxiety, delete their presence from places where they used to perform for scraps of validation. They withdraw so completely that people think they've had a mental breakdown. They haven't broken down. They're breaking through. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Let me share a composite example based on patterns he documented across multiple cases involving what he called the withdrawal of projections. Consider the profile of someone who had been the family mediator for decades, the friend everyone called in, crisis. The co-worker who stayed late to help others meet their deadlines while their own life fell apart. Then one day, nothing. Radio silence. Months of complete withdrawal that left everyone confused and angry. The phone calls they don't answer pile up. The guilt-tripping messages they don't respond to multiply. The accusations of being cold, of changing, of abandoning people start flowing in. And they read every single one without replying, because they're finally seeing clearly who actually cared about them versus who just cared about what they provided. What was happening during that silence? Reconstruction. They were finally giving themselves what they'd spent decades giving others. Attention, patience, understanding, space to feel without judgment, space to heal without performance, space to discover who they actually were beneath all the roles they'd been playing. During this isolation, something remarkable happens. They start to see their entire life with new eyes. All the times they were manipulated and called it love. All the moments they ignored screaming intuition to keep the peace. All the relationships where they gave everything and received nothing but criticism for not giving more. They see how many times they apologized for other people's bad behavior. How many times they made excuses for people who wouldn't make a single excuse for them. How many times they showed up for people who never showed up for them. How many times they prioritized people who made them an option. The clarity is brutal, absolutely devastating. They realize how many years they wasted on people who never deserved them. How much pain they endured that they never had to endure. How many times they betrayed themselves to avoid being abandoned by people who were never truly present anyway. But here's what Jung found so crucial. This brutal clarity doesn't destroy them. It liberates them, because you can't heal what you won't acknowledge, and they're finally acknowledging everything. Every wound, every betrayal, every moment they chose others over themselves. Every time they silenced their own needs to accommodate someone else's wants. Society interprets this withdrawal as weakness. Family members call it selfishness, abandonment, punishment. Friends call it overreaction, sensitivity, holding grudges. People who benefited from their lack of boundaries suddenly become experts on mental health, suggesting therapy, medication, intervention. But the withdrawing individual isn't running away from the world. They're running toward themselves. They're choosing their healing over everyone else's comfort for the first time in their lives. And that choice, that single decision to prioritize themselves, triggers everyone who relied on them staying small. Stage 4, the strategic return. They come back, but they're different. Fundamentally, irreversibly, permanently different. They've developed what might be called selective empathy. They haven't lost their ability to feel deeply, care intensely, love completely. They've gained the wisdom to choose where that energy goes, and once they withdraw it, it never comes back. This is what makes them dangerous. Not to good people, not to genuine connections, not to people who actually reciprocate care and respect, but to manipulators, users, and energy vampires. Because they cannot be manipulated anymore. You can't guilt-trip someone who has already survived the worst guilt imaginable. Someone who has sat alone with every accusation, every criticism, every claim that they're not enough, and decided those voices were wrong. You can't gaslight someone who trusts their own perception completely and has receipts to back it up. You can't control someone who would rather be alone forever than compromise their peace for 5 minutes. They return to the world with new standards, non-negotiable boundaries, clear expectations, and zero tolerance for the behaviors they use to absorb without complaint. They're not mean about it. They're not dramatic about it. They're just clear. And that clarity terrifies people who are used to operating in ambiguity. Now let me show you why people fear them so much. It's not because these transformed individuals are cruel or vindictive. It's because of what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection. Toxic people unconsciously try to destroy these awakened individuals, not because they did anything wrong, but because they act as a mirror to the toxic person's unacknowledged bad behavior. Jung wrote about this extensively. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. And most people choose to attack the mirror, because integration requires work, honesty, and uncomfortable self-reflection. Attacking the mirror just requires finding other people who will agree that the mirror is the problem. We see this illustrated clearly in a narrative that captures the pattern Jung observed repeatedly. Consider the profile of someone who was quiet for years, who absorbed everyone's dysfunction without complaint, who smiled through personal suffering to make others comfortable, who twisted herself into shapes that didn't fit, just to maintain relationships that were never reciprocal. Then one day, she stopped. She stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She stopped absorbing other people's emotions like a sponge. She stopped performing emotional labor for people who wouldn't cross the street for her. And she ruthlessly cut everyone off with surgical precision, not with drama, not with long explanations, not with angry confrontations or public call-outs, just with clarity and decisive action. She simply stopped participating in dynamics that required her to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating than her authentic self. She stopped showing up for people who only wanted her around when she was useful. People called her cold, changed, bitter, mean, unforgiving, cruel. They said she'd lost herself, that she wasn't the person they knew anymore. And they were right. She wasn't that person anymore. That person was a performance, a mask, a role she played to earn love she should have received freely. But she hadn't become cold. She'd become conscious. She hadn't lost her warmth. She'd stopped giving it to people who used it as a weapon against her. She hadn't become bitter. She'd become boundaried. And people who benefited from her having no boundaries couldn't tell the difference. This is the real danger. The awakened individual can see through manipulation with perfect clarity. They know every trick because those tricks were used on them for years. They know every guilt trip, every gaslighting tactic, every emotional manipulation strategy. They know the love bombing followed by devaluation. They know the apology without changed behavior. They know the promise that's never kept. They know the crisis that's always your responsibility to fix. And they're completely immune to all of it now. You can't fool someone who has studied the blueprint of their own deception. You can't manipulate someone who recognizes the playbook because it was used on them 1,000 times before. Moment arrives when the transformed individual realizes the profound truth that changes everything. They're not broken, they're evolved. While everyone else is still playing unconscious games, still repeating the same patterns, still pretending everything is fine when it's falling apart, they have developed something we might understand as awakened consciousness. This isn't about aggression or violence, it's about awareness. It's about seeing reality clearly and responding to it honestly instead of through the filter of who you wish people were. It's about understanding that protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's sacred. It's the most important thing you can do. Here's what society doesn't tell you, because society benefits from your confusion. Your urge to be alone after trauma isn't a sign of weakness or damage or dysfunction. It's a sign of strength, of wisdom, of evolution. Most people can't handle being alone with themselves for 20 minutes. They need constant noise, constant validation, constant distraction from their own thoughts. They fill every silence with scrolling, streaming, consuming anything that keeps them from facing what's actually happening inside them. They run from themselves and call it being social. But the individual who has withdrawn sits in silence and faces everything they've been running from. They face the truth that some people who claim to love them actually used them. They face the reality that they enabled their own suffering by not having boundaries. They face the fact that they've been living someone else's version of who they should be instead of discovering who they actually are. They face their anger at wasted years, their grief over relationships that were never real, their shame at ignoring red flags they saw clearly, their regret at choosing people who never chose them back, and they sit with all of it until it transforms from pain into power. This process destroys you, completely demolishes the old identity you were performing. The people-pleaser dies, the emotional sponge dies, the person who set themselves on fire to keep others warm burns out completely. But from those ashes, something stronger emerges. Someone who knows their worth, not because someone told them, but because they fought through hell to discover it. Someone who trusts themselves, not because it's easy, but because they've proven they can survive their own company and come out better for it. Someone who would rather walk alone in truth than walk with others in comfortable lies. The individual who completes this journey doesn't become bitter. They become boundaried. They don't become cold. They become selective. They don't lose their capacity for love. They learn to love themselves as fiercely as they once loved others, and that changes everything. This is the journey from victim to observer to empowered individual. From unconscious absorption of other people's chaos to conscious choice about what energy you allow in your life. From performing for approval to existing in authentic peace. From needing people to complete you to being so complete that you only allow in people who can match your energy. And it's not a journey everyone completes, because it requires something most people aren't willing to give. The courage to choose yourself when everyone else is choosing against you. The strength to stand alone when standing with others would be easier. The wisdom to know that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from people who can't love you properly. The individual who has survived severe trauma and emerged transformed understands a truth that terrifies most people. You don't need anyone. You can build a beautiful life in solitude. You can find peace in your own company. You can create meaning without external validation. And once you realize this, you become unstoppable, because the person who needs nothing from others cannot be controlled by anyone. But here's the final truth Jung discovered. This journey isn't about becoming isolated forever. It's about becoming so complete within yourself that when you do choose to connect with others, you're doing it from wholeness instead of emptiness. You're sharing your life instead of looking for someone to complete it. You're choosing people who add to your peace instead of people you have to recover from. Those who survive this process become part of a rare group. Those who can feel everything without being destroyed by it. Those who can see through illusions without becoming cynical. Those who can love deeply without losing themselves. Those who walk alone not because they hate the world, but because they love themselves too much to settle for less than they deserve. If you recognize yourself in these words, comment below, "I am the 1%, or "I walk alone." Let's see how many of us are on this path. Your solitude isn't your weakness, it's your superpower. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.